vigilante justice. And it wasn't pretty. Their lynching, lies, and the lash left a scar on the legacy of the West.
The Wild West, a period marked by lawlessness, rugged individualism, and untamed frontier life, has often been romanticized in American folklore. But beneath its legends and adventurous tales lies a harsh reality. Life in the American frontier from the mid-19th century through the early 20th century was fraught with dangers, not only from the wilderness and warring Native American tribes, but also from fellow settlers, outlaws, and even the justice system itself. Law enforcement was sporadic and often ineffective, leading to brutal punishments carried out by official authorities and vigilante groups alike. Many of these punishments were designed not only to enforce law and order, but to instill fear, and they often left little room for redemption. Hanging, the noose of justice. Perhaps the most infamous and widespread form of punishment in the Wild West was hanging. The sight of a noose swinging from a tree or a gallows became synonymous with frontier justice, and it was often the punishment of choice for serious crimes like murder, horse theft, or cattle rustling.
This man is a horse thief.
Hangings could be carried out by legal authorities, but far more common were the necktie parties, arranged by vigilante groups or lynch mobs. In the absence of established legal systems, many towns and territories took matters into their own hands. This led to the rise of vigilantism, where groups of armed settlers would capture criminals and carry out their own brand of swift justice. Sometimes, this form of punishment was based on genuine law enforcement failures, but often it was driven by mob mentality, racism, or personal grudges. The hangings conducted by lynch mobs were often brutal affairs, lacking any of the decorum of a formal trial or legal execution. Those condemned to hang might be dragged out of their homes or jail cells in the middle of the night, strung up to the nearest tree or post, and left to die as a spectacle for the public. Some hangings were slow and torturous, with victims left dangling until they suffocated. In other cases, the drop was long enough to snap the neck instantly, providing a quicker death. Certain figures in the legal system became notorious for their willingness to impose death by hanging. One of the most infamous was Judge Isaac Parker, known as the Hanging Judge of Fort Smith, Arkansas. Between 1875 and 1896, Judge Parker sentenced 160 people to hang, though only about 79 of these executions were carried out. Parker's courtroom was seen as a symbol of frontier justice, and though he was said to be a fair judge, his court's reputation for handing out death sentences became legendary. Tarring and feathering, public humiliation and torture. Tarring and feathering is one of the most humiliating and painful punishments inflicted on people in the Wild West, though its origins date back to medieval Europe. This form of punishment involved pouring hot tar over the victim's body and then covering them with feathers, making them a public spectacle of shame and discomfort. While not always fatal, tarring and feathering could leave victims with severe burns, infections, and long-lasting pain. The process of removing the tar was excruciating, as it would harden and cling to the skin, tearing off layers as it was scraped away. This form of punishment was often used on people accused of crimes such as theft, fraud, or political dissent. It was less about delivering justice and more about public humiliation, as victims would be paraded through town in their sticky, feathered state. Tarring and feathering was particularly common during periods of civil unrest, or when local communities sought to punish those seen as traitors or spies. While it wasn't as widespread in the Wild West as hangings or shootings, it was still a tool in the hands of angry mobs, especially when they wanted to make a public statement. Flogging, the whip of authority. Flogging, or whipping, was another brutal punishment employed in the Wild West to maintain order and discipline. Often seen as a middle ground between death and imprisonment, flogging was particularly popular for less severe crimes, such as theft, public intoxication, and disorderly conduct. However, despite being considered a lesser punishment, flogging could be extremely brutal and leave permanent physical and psychological scars on its victims. Flogging involved tying the accused to a post, tree, or whipping bench, stripping them of their clothing and lashing their exposed skin with a whip, often made from leather or horsehide. Depending on the severity of the crime, a person could receive anywhere from a few lashes to dozens or even hundreds. The number of lashes a person received often depended on the whim of the judge or local sheriff, and there were no consistent standards for how such punishments were administered. In the Wild West, where jails were often poorly maintained, overcrowded, or simply non-existent, flogging was seen as a convenient and effective way to deter crime. It provided a swift and public method of punishment that allowed authorities to maintain control without the need for long-term incarceration. The fear of flogging, along with the public spectacle that often accompanied it, served as a warning to would-be criminals. For many frontier towns, the public nature of flogging was as important as the punishment itself. Whippings were often carried out in the town square or in front of the local jail, where large crowds would gather to witness the event. The idea was that the sight of someone writhing in pain from the lash would instill fear in others and dissuade them from committing similar offenses. In some cases, the flogging was accompanied by additional humiliation, such as having the victim wear a sign stating their crime or being forced to apologize to the community. Despite being considered a lesser punishment than hanging or shooting, flogging could be incredibly severe. The lashes would often break the skin, causing deep cuts and bleeding. If the flogging continued long enough, the whip could tear into muscle tissue, leaving permanent scars and sometimes rendering the victim incapacitated for weeks or even months. Infections were a common consequence, particularly in the hot and unsanitary conditions of the frontier, and many victims of flogging suffered from long-term health problems as a result. For some individuals, flogging could be a death sentence in itself. If a person was particularly weak, elderly, or suffering from illness, the trauma of a severe flogging could lead to death. Even for those who survived, the experience often left lasting physical and psychological damage, with many flogging victims being permanently disfigured or left with chronic pain. Lynching, mob rule, and brutal executions. Lynching in the Wild West was not limited to hanging. It could involve any form of extrajudicial punishment or execution carried out by a mob. What made lynchings particularly brutal was the fact that they were often highly ritualized and public events, designed to terrorize not just the victim, but anyone who might cross the mob in the future. Lynching was frequently driven by racial tensions, with Black, Mexican, Native American, and Chinese individuals often the targets of mob violence. Racism fueled much of the mob action, as frontier towns saw an influx of diverse populations. These ethnic groups were often accused of crimes with little evidence, and rather than face a trial, they would be subjected to a lynching. The lynching of minorities in the Wild West was a clear example of how justice could be distorted by prejudice. Often, these punishments were carried out with the support of the local white population, and law enforcement would either turn a blind eye or actively participate. It wasn't just the threat of violence, but the spectacle itself that served as a warning to other minority groups to stay in their place. While many lynchings were carried out by hanging, Others involved far more gruesome methods. In some cases, mobs would torture their victims before killing them. Stories of people being shot multiple times, burned alive, or beaten to death are tragically common in the annals of Wild West history. The 1851 hanging of Joaquin Murrieta, a Mexican bandit, illustrates the brutality of these lynchings. Murrieta, according to legend, was hunted down by the California Rangers, who not only killed him, but beheaded him and preserved his head in a jar, which was then displayed across California as a symbol of justice. Though Murrieta's exploits have been romanticized, his execution and the subsequent display of his severed head show the lengths to which frontier justice could go. Branding. Marked for life. Branding was a punishment that left its victims with a permanent mark, both physically and socially. In the Wild West, branding was typically reserved for cattle rustlers or horse thieves, and the branding iron would often bear the mark of the person who was wronged. For instance, a cattle thief might be branded with the initials of the rancher whose cattle they stole. This form of punishment was particularly brutal not only because of the pain involved, but because it left a visible and permanent scar. Branding essentially labeled the criminal for life, making them a social outcast. In many cases, branded individuals would be shunned by their community, or forced to live in isolation. The practice of branding also reflected the deep-seated sense of property and ownership in the frontier culture. Cattle and horses were lifelines for many settlers, and stealing them was seen as one of the gravest offenses. Branding a thief was a way of making sure they could never hide from their crime, even if they tried to move to another town or territory. Shooting. The quick justice of the frontier. Not every punishment in the Wild West was slow and torturous. Some were quick, though no less brutal. Public executions by firing squad or single-shot revolver were a common form of punishment for serious crimes, particularly in territories where formal legal systems were still being established. One of the more romanticized forms of frontier justice was the duel, often portrayed as a noble and honorable way to settle disputes. In reality, duels were far less common than popular culture suggests, but they did occur, particularly among gunslingers and lawmen. The rules of dueling varied, but in most cases, the combatants would stand a set distance apart and fire at each other, either simultaneously or in turn. While some duels were fought over matters of honor or personal disputes, others were simply a way to settle scores between rival outlaws. The loser of a duel would often die quickly, though not always painlessly, depending on the skill of the participants. In some towns, particularly those without established courts or jails, criminals could be sentenced to death by firing squad. This form of execution was often used during times of civil unrest, or when a prisoner was considered too dangerous to be kept alive. In other cases, lawmen might shoot a suspect on sight if they were considered an immediate threat, with little regard for a formal trial. For many outlaws, the risk of being shot by a posse or bounty hunter was a constant threat. The culture of gunfighting was pervasive in the Wild West, and death by gunshot was often seen as an occupational hazard for those who lived outside the law.